Natasha Clark is back with us now. Natasha, just how consequential is that reform number in the first result?
That's huge, isn't it? The result
Really
we've
is.
just got from Sunderland, that will really worry some in Labour. And I'm also hearing that there's a few other Labour candidates who are genuinely very worried. There's actually one seat in Hull, Emma Hardy, who's saying that that's too close to call because of the reform vote. If that's the case, and there are Labour candidates worried about losing their seats to reform, that's really a bit of a throw forward about what we could see in the next Parliament. A potential, I know it's a little bit weird to be talking about the next general election, but that is the problem that Keir Starmer could have when he's looking at trying to unite his party. He's obviously going to see threats from the left of his party, of course, depending on who gets re-elected tonight, but also from that threat from the Reform Party. They will be taking chunks not just out of the Conservative vote, but out of the Labour vote too.
And Natasha, does this also explain a large part of the story of why the Tories are having such a terrible night? Because if you look at their numbers, they have come down, but it's quite clear that Reform have absolutely hammered them.
They have, and they've absolutely, of course, split the vote in so many areas, which will allow Labour to come through in those places where it was potentially too close. But look, there's obvious doubt over the idea that Reform could take 13 seats. There's doubt in the Tory camp that it will be that high. Potentially they're trying to play down expectations, but 13 seats. Some people in the Tories are thinking it's more likely going to be 3, 4, 5 seats. And according to that exit poll, people like Nigel Farage going to get in, Richard Tice going to get in, Ashfield, that's Lee Anderson's seat, probably still going to be a seat for the Reform Party as well. But yes, it is a redrawing of the political map in many ways. And the Reform, if this exit poll is true, that could be one of the huge stories of the night.
Absolutely. We're still waiting for Blyth and Ashington. That is likely, I think, to be the next seat. And we'll start to see if this is a pattern or just a one-off. But I suspect it's a pattern.
And you couldn't get two more different characters than Bridget Phillipson and the Reform candidate, or two more different propositions for the electorate than those two parties, could you?
Let's remember that this is somebody who was brought up in genuine, real grinding poverty. She had a very, very hard start in life. She's a properly working-class woman, and I've heard her talk about the education brief, and she has an absolutely astonishing grasp of it. She's going to be a formidable cabinet minister.
Yeah, and Andy, your thoughts on that? Because, you know, we're talking about the Reform relationship with Labour here, and it's happened very quickly that the Reform impact on the Conservatives and Labour is really a big part of this election.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to be looking at the numbers that we've just been discussing from a number of different angles. One angle that you look at it is from absolute terror, to be honest with you. That's a huge number for Reform.
Because we've seen some extraordinary candidates, haven't we, for Reform being exposed in terms of their social media comments about Hitler and about all sorts of things, which would be anathema to traditional Conservative England. And yet it doesn't seem to be stopping them in these northern seats at all.
The issue, I suppose, is whether or not this Reform number, let's see where it settles, is if you like, a blip. You know, I'm trying to be optimistic here, right? Is it actually just a different element of the total rejection that we're seeing? Is this where the anger sits? Does the anger sit in Reform? And if it is, you can do something about that. Would be the approach that I think that I'd be advocating.
I'm hearing in most of your answers this evening, maybe, you know, a sort of semaphore message to your parties and your friends in the Conservative Party: do not lurch to the right.
I think it'd be a disaster. I think it'd be a disaster for the Conservative Party. Much more importantly, it'd be a disaster for the country.
And John, when Nigel Farage declared that he was going to stand and going to be the leader of the party, you went to Clacton, didn't you, for his big party?
Yeah, I did. And look, you know, there is considerable support. It was a smart constituency to focus on. A lot of people from East London who'd moved out to the seaside, disaffected, angry, feeling that, you know, things have not worked out well for them in the last few years. And I think there has been generally a failure of politicians to talk in a grown-up way about immigration. And I think, look, that has been one of the huge drivers of support for Reform. And it is going to be a huge issue for Keir Starmer. We know that the Rwanda scheme is now scrapped, even after all the money that has been spent in trying to get it set up and ready to go. That's not going to happen. Well, if the small boats are continuing to rise, if there's net migration figures are continuing to be very high, then that is the kind of ground, the soil in which Reform does well.
And Lewis was just suggesting there that Yvette Cooper might be in trouble from Reform. If she lost to Reform, that would mean, I think, the Labour Party would have to relook again at its entire thinking on immigration, because she has been sort of front and centre of that sort of, you know, stop the boats policy with a kind of new coastal command and the rest of it.
And I must say that whenever Yvette Cooper came on my programme to talk about Labour's offering on immigration, it was never convincing. It was never convincing to me, and it was never convincing to our callers either. And she, you know, you wonder whether it hasn't been convincing to her own constituents. I mean, we're getting ahead of ourselves because we haven't got the result yet. But
I'm already speaking to Labour people who are saying that they are taking this as a message very clearly, that they are going to have to do something on immigration, and quickly. I mean, it's very tempting to talk about Reform and the threat that they pose to the Conservative Party, or the changes in the alchemy of politics they make to the Conservative Party. Of course, in one sense, that is irrelevant now, because the Conservative Party have never been less relevant. And what matters is what Reform does to the Labour Party. And they are going to be, I mean, I think it's almost certain from the figures that we're looking at, they're going to be second in clutches of Labour seats, and that changes the psychology of Labour Party thinking. And even if Yvette Cooper doesn't lose her seat, there is the folk memory, you don't have to go back very far, back to 2019, where we all know that the Labour Party came within a hair's breadth of not only becoming very close to being wiped out, but being wiped out entirely in its old northern heartlands. And that fear is still so close. So the idea that if it doesn't happen to the Conservative Party, that it could happen to Reform is going to sharpen the minds of the Labour Party.
This is going to change the way that Keir Starmer acts as Prime Minister and acts in government. Absolutely. And I think immigration, you're absolutely right, Lewis and John, that is central to this. But there's one other thing that we should mention, which is that Reform will come in saying we just must change this rotten, broken voting system. We've had 5 million people, we haven't got enough MPs. The Liberal Democrats agree. They don't like to say so, but they're absolutely as one with that. Quite a lot of Conservatives now are going to think, actually, do you know what? First past the post hasn't worked for us. We are going to see a big drive for voting reform. Whether you're against it or you're in favour of it, it is going to be a part of the politics of the next Parliament.
Yes, although I think it's going to be quite low down the agenda for Keir Starmer's government. It's 410 constituencies it is about.
I mean, Andrew, you and I were kind of treading around Westminster in 1997 when Tony Blair won the landslide, and there was all that talk about proportional representation then, and with the size of the majority, that idea got absolutely buried.
It's the leader who squashes it. Don't forget, of course, the Labour Party has voted in its constituencies and its unions very heavily for voting reform.
But this is where you can potentially see the fractures. I mean, Natasha's right in one sense. You know, this is a massive Labour victory. We shouldn't already be thinking about the next election, but you can already feel where it's going to require real prowess from Starmer to be able to navigate the politics of the next Parliament. Not because he's going to face parliamentary defeats, he's clearly not, but there's going to be all sorts going on. I mean, if you look at here, looking at 410 seats, what do you do with all of those MPs? It's not entirely impossible, for example, that you see a caucus emerge of more pro-European-minded Labour members.
Absolutely.
But then you've got Reform on the rise in different parts of Northern England, in Brexit voting Labour seats. How do you manage that? But at the same time, you can also see that if Labour does it has got Reform in its mind and a more radical right Conservative Party on its mind, as we've seen emerge all over Europe. You can also see the possibility that on its left that they have a problem with a resurgent Green Party and so on. So it is going to take a bit of political suppleness from Keir Starmer, which he has shown on many occasions, but it is going to take some real manoeuvrability to be able to navigate the politics of the next Parliament to get to the next election and be successful again.